Hi, everyone. Welcome to CMN 201, the social impact of mass media. And I am the instructor, Lillian Ruiz. And in today's video, what I wanted to do was to go through some of the elements of the course. And what I'm assuming is that you are already on Moodle, or you wouldn't be watching this particular video. And you can see that on our Moodle site, the way that I've constructed it is that at the very top, there's a section, a general section that basically serves as our menu for the class as a whole. And I have multiple icons there. And the first icon is for syllabus and other documents. That's what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. And if you were to open that icon, you'll see that I have uploaded our syllabus. And as the semester progresses, I'll be uploading any of the documents that I would normally share as handouts in a face-to-face class. I teach this class online in the fall, and I teach it in person in the spring. And then I have an icon called past class sessions. So basically, your current week will be what is visible on our website. And that said, you can always access previous weeks by going into the previous class sessions folder. But our week that will be most visible will be the current week that we are at in our semester. And I'll show you that next week. And there also is an icon for discussion forum. And what I try to do with my online classes is to try to replicate as much as possible what I would do in a face-to-face class. So these videos that I will be posting throughout the course of the semester, I'll be covering class material in the videos much like I would be doing in a face-to-face class if we were meeting live. And in the discussion forum, that would be the portion where we would have a kind of class discussion if we were having a face-to-face class. What I'll be doing is I will be posting questions in the discussion forum. I call them attendance questions because your response to the questions will serve as, quote, attendance, unquote, for that particular class. So at the ending of every video, what you will have is a discussion forum question, which I will talk about in greater depth. And then you can see that there are two other icons in our general section in Moodle. Both are optional. One is green. It is the optional chat. So I have a chat room established for us in the event that you wanted to chat with your classmates or chat with me. And there also is the optional Zoom, and that's a blue icon at the bottom of the general section. And that gives you my Zoom information if you wanted to Zoom with me. And you can see that what's visible is week one, which is where we are now, immediately after the general section. And what I try to do is to post at times when this class would normally meet face-to-face. So the face-to-face section meets Thursday evening. So you can assume that every Thursday evening I will be posting a video and that you will have 48 hours to watch that particular video and to respond to its corresponding attendance question. Though if you need additional time, please let me know. And you can see that today what I have scheduled is for us just to have an introduction, just to review the syllabus and the course outline. And I've also got a little cartoon there to illustrate the importance of the syllabus, that the answers you seek can indeed be found in the syllabus. So what I'm going to do now is review the syllabus and course outline. What I suggest is that you might want to print up a hard copy of it. I think it makes things easier just to be able to see it. We are at about minute 4:15 now, if you want to stop the video and then start up again. And if you are looking at the syllabus, you can see that at the very top, there is my name. Most students call me Lillian, and most people call me Lillian, but feel free to call me what feels most comfortable to you. My phone number is there where you could leave a voicemail. My email address is there, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And you might have noticed that I don't have a first initial in my email address the way most people do. It's just my surname. The reason why, it's kind of hard to believe, but I started at GCC when we had not instituted a campus-wide email system yet. I started in 1993. It's hard to believe so many years have gone by. At any rate, this illustrates how little we understood about how the internet was going to transform everything, because when email addresses were initially issued, it was based on surname. And obviously, there's a greater likelihood of duplication. That was figured out very quickly so that the first initial was instituted. So if you see someone at GCC with just a surname for their email address, they've probably been at the institution for quite a while. My office is in North 328A. That happens to be in the Inclusion and Diversity Center, which is a dedicated space for students who support the ideals of inclusion and diversity. It has a little workstation area, it has a kitchenette area, and it also has a common room with some soft furnishings, some board games. My office is also housed in that area as well, if you ever wanted to pop in and talk about inclusion and diversity. Now, my office hours, and I don't know how useful this will be for you as an online student, but these are times when I should be in my office if I'm not at a meeting. Monday, Wednesdays, 9:30 to 10:30, and Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10:30 to 11:30, or also by appointment, so feel free to make an appointment with me if you'd like. So, in terms of the textbooks for this class, believe it or not, there actually has been some academic scholarship done on the topic of horror film, which is the topic that this class is going to be talking about this semester. And I've devoted this course to this topic for several years now. And the idea is that horror film is never meant to be examined from an academic perspective. It's part of popular culture. But popular culture oftentimes serves as a wonderful mirror on our society. So I teach classes in popular culture and media. I also teach classes in public speaking and communications. I mostly teach classes in the English department. And what you will find is that our analyzing horror film in some ways would be very similar to analyzing text in an English class. So there's a good amount of overlap. So to give you an idea of some of the work that's been done on this particular topic, I've got 3 texts that are all excellent. We won't be reading the texts in their entirety, just pieces of those texts. The first is entitled Projected Fears, Horror Films in American Culture by Phillips. The second is entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Obviously, it's focusing on the United States by Madry. And lastly, Horror Film, A Critical Introduction. Now, obviously, horror film is something that is global and we could study it from many cultural lenses. The focus is going to be on the West, specifically the United States. And my hope is that you're taking this class because you are an aficionado of horror film. And that in and of itself is somewhat unusual. I know that fear is something that most people dislike and want to avoid, and yet there are groups of people, myself included, who happen to be interested in horror, whether it be novels or fiction or film or some combination thereof. And yes, in the English department, I teach a Gothic literature class where we read some of the classics of horror that have become classics and have become iconic because of film. Things like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But that said, in terms of this particular class, we will focus on the films, even though some of those films have their basis in text. And Gothic literature is a good companion class, actually, that you might want to think about. I offer it in the fall semester very deliberately because I want to have the Halloween. And this class, our horror film class, is very deliberately offered in the fall semester as an online class so that the largest audience can take it, again, because of Halloween. And then I have that it's assumed that students will have a good dictionary at the source for reference. I'm well aware that those are loaded into computers and phones and so forth, but having access to it and using it can be 2 different things. And the dictionary does more than just give definitions and spellings. It actually talks about things like etymology, which is the word history and origins, or it talks about pronunciation, or it talks about usage in terms of parts of speech. And the thesaurus is a wonderful resource for synonyms, words that have similar meanings, sometimes antonyms, words with opposite meanings. And while this isn't an English class, you will be doing some writing. So these are wonderful resources for you to use. So in terms of a course description, this class is an in-depth focus analysis of a specific theme or topic in mass media. And mass media includes things such as film, television, print, music, and video games. And I usually teach an introduction to mass media in the summer, which is a recommended class for this course, but not required. It's an introductory class where we talk about how mass media, such as film, TV, print, music, and video games, influences our view of society. But this particular course is focusing on a particular area, and that happens to be horror film. But all of these things can be used to examine social and cultural issues such as race, class, and gender, which we will be talking about and a lot more as the semester progresses. So, learning outcomes. As a result of successfully completing this course, students will be able to summarize some of the scholarship of various mass media to understand mass media's academic relevance. Recognize and articulate symbolic and metaphoric meanings in various mass media, so to improve critical thinking skills. So this is something we'll talk about next class, is what is symbolism and what is metaphor. And it's a literary element, but it can be applied to lots of other disciplines as well. How to improve critical thinking skills. There is a lot of critical thinking language used in college, which is not about being negative or critical, but it's about asking questions, asking why. Something that actually, ironically, toddlers do really well. They ask why. You can't always provide a thorough answer. I've always said that's the difference between high school and college, that in high school you ask or learn about what, and in college you ask and learn about why. To identify and analyze the cultural significance of mass media to understand the influence it has on our society. To gather and appraise examples of various mass media, which for us will be various horror films. So to identify some of the cultural and social anxieties of our time. To explain in oral and written form the uses, meanings, and popularity of mass media. To improve oral and written communication skills. And I have that on all of my syllabi, whether it's a communications class or whether it happens to be a media class or it happens to be a class in English. To understand and draw connections between mass media and oneself, others, and society at large. So to identify mass media's social, political, and cultural influence. And yes, horror film has social, political, and cultural influence. Examine and interpret data on the use and popularity of various media. So to improve analytic skills. So why is it that this is such a popular genre? And what does that say about us as a people? And examining issues such as race and class and gender and the way that's portrayed in various mass media to better understand such issues in our own society. So, as I indicated, I'm trying to replicate as much as possible what we would do in a face-to-face class. So, if we were meeting face-to-face, we would meet once a week, Thursday evening at 6 p.m., which is when my class is offered in the spring. So what you can expect in the fall is that every Thursday by 6 p.m., I will have a video like this one talking about class material. And honestly, I'm going to try to post that video before Thursday by 6 p.m., but you can expect that by Thursday at 6 p.m. it would be up. And you have 48 hours to watch the video for that particular class and answer its corresponding attendance question, which is in our discussion form. Though if you need more than 48 hours, please ask me for an extension. And your answer on the discussion form is counted as attendance for the class. And you do not need to respond to your classmates' discussion form responses. But what you do need to do is to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So if you were to do so, what you would get is basically a review of the kind of class discussion we might have in a live class. Now, that said, you're certainly encouraged to respond to your classmates' posts, much like in a live class, you're encouraged to raise your hand and respond to someone's comment, but it's not required. I know that some students learn best by participating, others learn best by listening, so you can decide how much or how little you want to participate. But you do have to read all of the discussion forum responses and my responses in turn, because I will be responding to all of you. And then any written work that you have, things like journals or the final project or the final exam, which I will be talking about in more depth in the next few minutes, I ask that you send that to my email. Again, that's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu via PDF, please, via PDF. This is how my grading program works best, so that I can evaluate that work and return it to your email. And just general points, you're expected to complete all reading and writing assignments by the due date. The best way, basically, to do well in this class is to watch all of the videos. And I will be also having us watch all of the films. Now, that said, my hope is that I can find all of these films online for free. Thus far, I've been able to do so, but you never know because things come on and off the internet. So you may not necessarily be able to access all of the films for free. I do have them on reserve, however, in the GCC library. So, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about horror film. We're going to watch horror films. We'll talk about their importance in that particular time period. And then I'm going to ask that you submit in periodic journal entries, which discuss your reactions to the films and the readings that we've been doing. These will be mostly weekly, in addition to the discussion forum questions, which will definitely be weekly. There will also be a final course project that I'll talk a little bit more about as the semester progresses. But basically, the final course project is a way for you to analyze a specific element about our topic of horror film. And I'll give you some suggestions, but I encourage you to be creative. And you can begin the final project basically now, sort of thinking about what it is you might want to discuss. Now, certainly, as the semester progresses, you'll have more and more information about the genre, and that might help inform your choice. But the idea is that this final project is due at the very ending of the semester. So you have the entire semester to consider and to create. However, the sooner you hand in the final project, obviously, the better off everybody is. And then lastly, we end the semester with the final exam, which is an essay exam, and it is open book, open notes. And if I were giving this final exam in a face-to-face class, you would have approximately 2 to 3 hours to finish it. Again, we're not in a face-to-face class, so I am going to give you 24 hours in which to take that exam and return it to me via PDF to my email. And that said, I don't expect you to work on it for 24 hours. I expect you to spend 2 to 3 hours on it. So before I get into some of the specifics of the course itself, if you are new to GCC, the Institutional Services Disability Statement reads that GCC values inclusion and equal access to programs and activities. It's committed to fostering an environment of respect and full participation. The goal is to create learning environments that are equitable, inclusive, and welcoming. So if there are aspects of the instruction or design of this course that result in barriers to your inclusion or accurate assessment or achievement, please notify me as soon as possible. And if you're a student with a disability and you need some reasonable academic accommodations, please contact the Office of Disability Services, and you can see some of their information there. So those journals that I was talking about that you will be doing mostly on a weekly basis, these are meant as a kind of informal opportunity to analyze the various films and media that we will be discussing. Thus, guidelines will be very informal. You should basically use the journals as an opportunity to explore the film in the way that you think would be most beneficial. Though I will give you some suggestions on class. But the idea is that the journals can reflect relevant thoughts, questions, etc. And questions sometimes are even more important than the answers. The journals also provide an excellent opportunity to brainstorm and free write project topics, since I'm telling you right now that there's going to be a final project, so you can begin to sort of analyze ideas. And final exam questions, well, you can't create your own final exam question. You might be able to anticipate the final exam question in your journals. Because they're informal, they're graded informally. I don't grade them for grammar and mechanics. I grade them for content. However, you should still exercise some care in the actual writing. Journals will be thus graded on a checkmark scale because they are informal, with a excellent being a plus, a good being a check plus, a satisfactory being a check, and that's where most of the grades fall. There also is a less satisfactory, a check minus, or an unsatisfactory, which is a minus. Late journals will lower your grade by 1 full grade. No late journal will be accepted after 1 week has elapsed unless you've made other arrangements with me beforehand. So please ask for an extension if you need it. And I ask that you submit in those journals to my email via PDF, and then I can evaluate and return back to you. So the attendance and discussion form, which are one and the same, that class activity and discussion is extremely important, can't be made up. So absences and tardiness will be negatively reflected in your participation grade. While each case is different, anything more than 2 absences could lower your grade. Excessive absences could even result in failure. You don't need to notify that you're going to be absent for a particular class, but do speak with me if you're going to miss several classes. And of course, you can consult with me during office hours or by appointment. So this final course project, I wanted to talk just a little bit about it today, and then we'll follow up over the course of the semester. I'm thinking that for most of you, the final course project will be a written analysis of horror film in a particular mass medium, though there's room for more creative approaches. After all, this is a media class. So you can actually use media to create a course project. And while most of my students write papers, you can do something a little different, like create a short horror film. I've had students do that. Or perhaps create a model and give a presentation to class. In fact, if you go to the GCC library, you will find on display one of the models one of my students created that she showed to our face-to-face class when we were, I think this was about a year or so ago, but the date will be there, when she was talking about some iconic horror films for her final project. And very well done, I might add. So I've had students actually write short stories. So you have lots of options. But if you like the traditional academic analysis, then know that that should be typed double space with 1-inch borders. I hope this sounds familiar from previous English classes. English Comp 1 is a prerequisite for this particular course. You should have pages that are numbered and a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that has a title, your name, the course and section number, my name, and the due date. And if you are going to be submitting in that kind of project, you would submit that in via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. But again, you might be doing something a little bit more creative, and that's usually easier to do in a face-to-face class, but we can talk about possibilities with an online course. And that said, you have the option to revise your final course project subject to my permission. So you would need to hand it in early enough so that there would be the possibility of a revision. Obviously, if you hand it in at the ending of the semester, there wouldn't be time for that. I do ask that you submit the original graded project along with the revision. So we'll talk a little bit more about the course project as the semester progresses. I realize I'm giving you lots of information. I don't want to overwhelm you, but I did want to cover holistically what we'll be doing over the course of this semester. And I'm going to skip the section on plagiarism and talk about that next class, and just go to the grading to give you an idea of how you'll be evaluated. So 25% is that participation discussion form. So you want to answer all of the discussion form questions. Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses, my responses in turn. This will help you with your final course project and certainly with the final exam. Journals, those weekly responses you'll be doing to the films that we will be watching. Most students submit in about a page or so for each journal or each film, but as long or as short as you'd like it to be. That would be 25%. The course project, which again is due at the ending of the semester, 25%. If you're doing a written course project, I usually suggest to students about 4 pages or so. But as long or as short as it needs to be for you to do a good job to analyze whatever topic it is that you've selected. And then that final exam, which is an essay exam, and I'll give you choice. And that is open book, open notes. And I will post it and give you 24 hours to respond to it. But I expect that you'd spend about a couple of hours or so working on it. So it shouldn't have the kind of depth that, let's say, a final project would have. That's 25%. For an A, excellent, B, good, C, satisfactory. And yes, there are letters that follow C, but I prefer not to discuss them, especially on the first day of class. The next document is about criteria for essay evaluation. It talks a little bit about what an A or a B or C looks in terms of written work. You're doing a final course project that happens to be written. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as the semester progresses. And I wanted to focus on the course outline. So in the course outline, these are my best guesses of what we are going to be doing and when. And with a few notes that dates and assignments might be subject to change over the course of the semester. 2, that reading should be completed before the dates indicated below. So ideally, you would have done the reading ahead of time so that it makes some sense what the class discussion is going to be about. I say this with all my classes. This class is a little bit trickier, however, because we are also going to be watching film. And if you don't want spoilers, then maybe you don't want to do the readings first. Maybe you want to watch the films first, then do the readings. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing this. But you are expected to do both as well as watch class videos. And as I indicated, all films may not be available for free online, so you might need to rent or stream or purchase or borrow some of the films. Although thus far I've been pretty successful with finding free online links. And it's probably obvious, but I wanted to say that pursuant to the character of the genre, some of the material is graphic in nature. So today you can see week 1. We're just merely talking about the introduction. So I have that scheduled for Thursday, the 5th, even though you might be watching this video before then, or maybe perhaps after that. As I said, each video will be posted by Thursday at 6 p.m. Although my goal is to post even earlier. And you have 48 hours to watch that video. So next week, we get to talk about the topic of horror film and fear. And why is it that fear is attractive to some viewers and readers? And ideally, what I suggest that you would have had read by then is Projected Fears, the introduction to the book, horror film book in chapter 4, What is Horror? Chapter 5, Why of Horror? Chapter 6, Critics and Censors of Horror. Now, that said, you may not have access to the textbooks yet, I understand. So don't panic if you don't have the reading done by that time. I'm going to be covering that reading. And I'm also going to be posting a documentary for you to view. And we will be viewing the documentary on Thursday, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Yes, it is the name of one of our texts, and they actually came up with a documentary as well, which serves as a nice overview of what it is we're going to be talking about in this semester. So I see next week as kind of introductory, laying the foundation before we actually start watching horror films. What I've done is I've selected films to represent each decade. And of course, multiple films could do that. But I chose films that were iconic or relevant for any particular reason that that particular decade embraced that film, which we will be discussing. And we start with the origin of horror film, which is thought to be in the 1920s. And that film, the first feature-length horror film, as we will discuss, is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a black and white silent film that came out in 1920. And it also is an artistic model of expressionism, which we will be discussing as well. And the readings that talk about that film in the Nightmares book, it's chapter 1, Origins in Film Gothic. In horror film, it's chapter 1, Genreification. So again, there's lots of different ways that you could go about doing this, in that you can ultimately decide that you want to talk about or read and watch, or watch and read. So it depends on which order you want to do them in. So journal number 1, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So basically 48 hours after the posting of the video, much like the class discussion forum question, 48 hours after that, the assumption is that you would hand in your journal on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And then we move into the following week, which is the 26th, or I'm sorry, which is it's the 26th of September. That's week 4. Horror film in the 1930s. And Dracula, and there were many horror films that were important in the 1930s, if you're familiar with the Universal Studio movie monsters. But the first, and it's considered to be the first American horror film, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is German. So what's considered to be the first feature-length American horror film is Dracula with Bela Lugosi. And that is the film that we will be watching and discussing. So the chapters that discuss that in the Nightmares book are Chapter 2, Studios Horrors in the 1930s, Chapter 10, Reality Bites, Chapter 11, Browning. So Todd Browning was the director of the film. And then journal number 2, Dracula, meaning that ultimately what you would end up doing is submitting in a journal. Again, you might want to do the reading first, then see the film. You might want to see the film first and then do the reading. My class videos will be talking about the film as well. So week 5, the 3rd of October, horror film in the 1940s. This film is perhaps a little bit less known. It's called Cat People, 1942. And the 1940s is a particularly interesting decade. In fact, all decades are interesting decades. But when we get to the 40s, we'll talk about some of the social tensions that were going on that led to something like Cat People, because it really is, in many ways, ahead of its time in terms of cinematography, as well as the actual topic and screenplay itself. And the texts that are related to that are Chapter 3, Shadow Play, and Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Shadow Play, is in the Nightmares book. Chapter 2 is in the Horror Films book, about horror film from 1939 to 1973. So that's a big chunk there. And again, 48 hours later would be your Cat People journal. And then horror film in the 1950s. And the 50s film, and it's very much merges into science fiction. And we'll talk about how horror oftentimes merges into science fiction. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So that's 1956. So you're reading Projected Fears, Chapter 2, Thing from Another World, and Nightmares, Chapter 4, Body Snatchers. So that's our 4th journal. And then week 7, on the 17th, we talk about horror film in the 1960s. And the very iconic Psycho came out in 1966. So we will be watching that and discussing it, as well as discussing Chapter 3 in Projected Fears on Psycho, and Chapter 5 in Nightmares, California Gothic, and Chapter 12, Alfred Hitchcock, the iconic director who directed Psycho. And this is where I cheated, because I said that I had a representative film for each decade, but the 60s were particularly busy. It was a tumultuous time in the 1960s, and I suggest that horror film reflected much of that anxiety. So there are 2 films that are going to be representative of the 1960s. So in addition to Psycho, then, and that was in 1966, 2 years later, Night of the Living Dead, 1968, by director George Romero, who basically reinvented the idea of zombie, which used to be a Haitian construct, and brought it to the masses about the dead being reanimated into life. And actually, it's how the seed of this particular class was born, because several years ago there was a television series that came out that seemed to capture the zeitgeist of the moment, and it was called The Walking Dead. And Harvard University, of all places, ended up creating a class in zombies. And when I'd read about that, I thought, well, GCC could do the same. And I created a class with a topic on zombies, and that was the initial introduction. However, zombies have become a lot less popular. But they never die, as we know that about zombies, so perhaps they will resurge in popularity, much like the spin offs from Walking Dead will resurge. But what I ended up doing was changing the topic of zombies to horror film, which is much more general. And I've been an aficionado of horror film for just about all of my life, as far back as I can remember. So, Night of the Living Dead, the things we'll be reading in Projected Fears will be about specifically Night of the Living Dead, as well as in the Nightmares book, Chapter 6, The Apocalypse, and Chapter 14, George Romero himself. And of course, 48 hours later, you've got Night of the Living Dead. And then week 9, horror film in the 1970s. And the 1970s is when the very iconic The Exorcist came out. And I can tell you right now, if you're not familiar with The Exorcist, it is particularly graphic. So we'll talk about that. And if you feel uncomfortable watching the film in its entirety, you do not need to see the film in its entirety. I will assign up until the point where the film does become graphic, so you could stop at that point if you so wanted to, and respond to your journals in that way. But you can also talk about the film as a whole. Projected Fears talks about The Exorcist as well as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which might be another film that you are familiar with in the 1970s. We won't be watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, however. And horror film in chapter 3 talks about horror film from 1974 to the present. So basically, it's talking more about contemporary films. And of course, there would be a journal on The Exorcist. Horror film in the 1980s, and I cheated again because this film debuted in 1978, so technically it was in the 70s, but it led to an entire movement of the 1980s. The 1980s were very much known for slasher horror films, and it all began with the 1978 film Halloween with John Carpenter. And that's the film that we're going to be viewing as representative of what happened in the 1980s, as well as reading in Projected Fears, Chapter 6, about Halloween, and in Nightmares, Chapter 7, a chapter entitled Shrinking Man, because Halloween does have a central female character as our hero, and Chapter 15, John Carpenter, the director himself. And then in week 11, we talk about horror film in the 1990s. Lots of options here. But I think about 1990s and the advent of this revolution in technology with the internet and self-recording, which has led to social media and where we are today. And I think the Blair Witch Project in 1999 helped to anticipate much of that obsession and with documentation, video documentation, and also this obsession as well with technology. So we will watch we will watch the Blair Witch Project and read Chapter 8 in Nightmares about postmodern horror. Chapter 9 is a continuation of that, postmodern horror part 2, as well as Chapter 9, digital horrors. That gets us into the 2000s, which puts us into week 12, around the 21st of November, where we will watch 28 Days Later. And it happens to be a kind of reinvented zombie tale, but also about a virus that becomes an epidemic and possibly a pandemic. In many ways, that too was ahead of its time when we think about what we experienced with COVID. So, in addition to watching 28 Days Later, you will be reading the conclusion to Projected Fears, as well as Chapter 7 of horror film with spooky sounds. Of course, you'd be submitting in a journal. And the journals, of course, if you need additional time for the journals, much like if you need additional time for your discussion forum responses, just let me know and I'll be happy to let you have an extension. The 28th of November is Thanksgiving, so we won't be having a class then. That gets us into week 14, the beginning of December, where we get to talk about horror film in the 2010s. And it was really this film that led to my deciding that I wanted to do a class that focused on horror film, which you may or may not have seen. The film Get Out, which is absolutely a masterpiece in my opinion. In 2017 it came out, and that's representing our horror film in the 2010s. So you'll be reading finally in the horror film book, Chapter 8, Colors of Fear, and in Nightmares, skimming a filmography. I don't expect you to read it word for word, but it lists many of the iconic horror films. Some we would have viewed in this class, many we wouldn't have. So if you end up becoming a fan, that'll give you perhaps a bit of a watch list. And our final journal for Get Out, and then our final exam. And that happens to be on the 12th of December. And this would be the last date that you could hand in that final course project. But as I indicated, early submissions encouraged. The earlier you submit it in, the more likely it is that you have the option of doing a revision if you so elected to. But that means that you've got the entire semester at your fingertips if you decided to let's say, devote your final course project to one of the later films or one of the later things that we're discussing. So that gives you an idea of the class itself. Basically, what's left is our attendance question for the discussion form. And since today is just purely introduction, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself briefly to the class. Feel free to upload videos or audios, but not required. And again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And then what we will do next week is to lay the foundation for this course about horror film. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And certainly if you've got any questions or concerns, reach out to me, whether it be voicemail or email or in person. Take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.